Okay, a wonderful afternoon to all wonderful listeners in Cyberworld. Thank you always for joining us, as always. Today we have a cracking discussion planned for you all, and we would encourage all the participants out there and our listeners to participate via the chat functions. Unfortunately, Tim is unable to join us, but today I will be assisted by Mirko Kagura, our resident Chief Investment Officer. How are you, my friend? How are you going?
G'day, Luke. Going really well. What about you?
Mate, I'm doing wonderfully well, mate. I'm doing wonderfully well. I'm really enjoying this time of the year, Mirko. The weather is now changing, so you get a bit of that crispness in the air. You know, where it gets a bit crisp in the morning. So it's always nice, and we're coming up to Easter, which is always a nice little break as well. So looking forwed to that, mate. So have you got anything planned for Easter?
No, spend some time with family, hanging around, not going away. So no, it should be fun. Always a good time around the Easter break. And speaking of weather changes, I walked in the office today. The heater was on, and I looked around and said, "Why is the heater on?" So I just closed the door to my office and just said, "I'll pretend that's not happening." So it's a bit going on.
No, there is a bit, mate. There is a bit. And today, mate, we've got a cracking conversation about the housing crisis. And I guess maybe if I preface what we're trying to do, I guess from that point of view, Australians have always loved talking about housing, from how much a house is worth to renovations and to even investment properties from that point of view. But I guess what we've seen probably in the last 12 months and probably over the last 3 to 4 years is that the conversation in relation to housing is now changing, and it's probably gaining a lot more momentum at this particular moment in time. And I guess when we talk about housing today, we often talk about it in the prism of a crisis, if that kind of makes sense. And I guess the real issue now centres on not about housing per se and about the kind of build and what to build and so on, but it really centres on the unaffordability of housing. And that's both for buyers and for renters. And I guess, and even for those people who are lucky enough to own their own home today, Mirko, they're also worried about their children and their loved ones in terms of how will they be able to afford to enter the market. So, I guess in the old days, or not so long ago, we used to look at people who could not afford housing, and we often associated that with people who were either poor or disadvantaged. And I guess today, we're no longer thinking of it in those realms. It's no longer about a poor and disadvantaged problem, but, rather it's, I guess our new reality here in Australia is that Australian homes have simply become really, really expensive. And if they become too expensive, society can't work normally in terms of what we're accustomed to. So that's the prism, I guess, in terms of where we currently find ourselves. I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of housing itself. Do we see housing as something being a basic human right, or do we see it as being one of those tools for those fortunate enough to profit from?
Well, I suppose the big thing for me is the idea of the Great Australian Dream. And, as we know, the Great Australian Dream always used to be the house, the white picket fence, the garden, the barbecues outside. I'm not that convinced that is the Great Australian Dream. It might be for the baby boomers, and it might be aspirational for their children, as far as they're concerned, for their kids. But I'm not 100% convinced, given what's going on in the marketplace, that everyone aspirationally wants to continue owning homes. And I think about, are we heading down the same route that, particularly in Europe, where home ownership is not the same, and it's unless it's inherited and the like, we don't sort of see that. But going back to the question about, is housing a basic human right? Well, it is. We talk about Maslow's hierarchy, and we talked about this earlier today, and shelter is one of the first cabs off the rank. So everybody needs to feel safe and have a shelter, and we are talking about some fairly wide extremes here as well. So we're talking about the people that want to own their apartment, their flat. We want the people that want to own the big McMansions in the suburbs. And then you've got the people that are actually rough sleeping as it is already, and the homeless. And I think the last count, there's about 120 odd thousand people that sleep rough every night in Australia. And, their version of events is going to be very different to what other people are talking about. I can't get into the market because I don't have $1.5 million, for example. So I think it's certainly worthy of discussion. I'll be super interested to hear what people have got to say on the other end of the screen here about their thoughts on the like. But I really think that we get talking about these things in time of a crisis, if you like. We love throwing the word crisis around, but I think it's time to reflect a little bit as well and sort of think about what have we done to perhaps exacerbate the problem. Whether it's investors, whether it's government, whether it's local council, and I think that there's a bit of reflection that needs to be done too about where we've come from.
Yeah, no, look, I think well said there, Mirko. In terms of, I'm a lot like you. I tend to view housing as being a basic human right rather than a tool from which to profit from. But in saying that, the system has been very much built where it's very much the latter rather than the former. And I guess for the benefit of context for our listeners as well, and thank you again for everybody who's joined us as well. I always get stunned by the numbers, but if we think about some historical context, back in the post World War II and so on, it was considered part of the Australian vernacular was that it was very much considered that everyone was deserving of a home. And everyone was deserving of having a house which provided them with shelter, protection, and so on from the elements. But also, there was a particular standard in terms of the kind of homes that people would have from that point of view. And I guess Australian cities at the time were being built when the car was also invented too, Mirko. So whereas most European cities, most American cities, countries with longer histories, I guess, from that point of view, they were a lot more densely populated. In Australia, because of the car and because of the advent of those sort of things, we had this thing called urban sprawl, and we started to move out and out and out from that point of view. And the car was always going to take us into town and so on. And I guess what we kind of underestimated is how big our population would get over time, without realising that sort of stuff. So I think for mine, when I think about that question about whether or not a house is a human right or a tool from which to profit, it does go to the concept of inequity, I guess, in society at this particular moment in time, because the reality I guess from my end, and this is probably where my thinking is that if you've got the opportunity to buy a house, or be it through the bank of mum and dad, or be it through your own hard work, or whatever it might be from that point of view, and if you're fortunate enough to be in that position to do so, you are at a complete and competitive advantage compared to anybody else who can't do that. And from an equality perspective and from a timing perspective, if you think about that, that has impacts on multiple generations moving forwards. So today, if you're able to own 3, 4, 5, 6 homes as an example versus somebody who's able to own 0 homes, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or in the next 100 years, what do the future generations look like in that space? And that's where I kind of sit back and think, maybe this housing debate is something that we should be discussing. And I do agree with you. It's a shame that we always discuss these things when we get to the crisis point. So rather than focusing on, these things becoming, or focusing on these issues when they're smaller problems, we wait till we get to the emergency piece. But that's the Australian way of life, I dare say. But if we think about affordability, and I guess that probably sits at the core of this whole debate. Since Federation, and we've got data to show our listeners today, but since Federation, we know that to buy a home, from that point of view, it was generally 3 to 4 times medium earnings. So whatever the average earnings were in a household, it was generally 3 to 4 times. So for example, if the average earnings in a household were $100,000, if we think about it from Federation through to the year 2000, the average cost of a house, or the medium house price, was somewhere around $300,000 to $400,000. So if everybody and if our listeners sit back for a moment and reflect back on that, they'd probably sit back and say, actually, that's about right with what we were bringing in the household between my husband, my wife, my husband, whatever it might be, whatever I was bringing into the house from that point of view, and whatever we paid for our house, that seems to be about right. And this kind of was always the case, and it pretty much became the rule of thumb up until the year 2000, however. And from the year 2000, what's happened is we've seen house prices increased to as high as 7-8 times as a national average, probably more closer to 9 times in truth. So what we've seen is house prices double in value, yet incomes remain stagnant from that point of view, which has caused this massive stretch. I guess there's a number of reasons for this, Marco, but I'd be interested to, I guess, get your thoughts.
We've got
listeners.
We've got a visual on this one as well. It's, just listening to you talk through that and sort of say we've always had this 3-4 times, income coming into the house in terms of, purchasing a home. And I actually did, when we were preparing for this, I sort of cut some numbers for when we were buying our family home and the like, and the numbers sort of stack up there. And when you look at today's scenario, 3-4 times, maybe if there's 300 grand coming into the house, that's the case, and which we know is not what's happening in the real world. But if I show you, if I share this screen with you, should be able to see the graph there, and this is exactly what we're talking about. So we're talking about our earnings here, the dark black line there, and then looking at the dwelling prices, and as you can see, for exactly what you said, from the year 2000, it's just shot up through the roof, and you can see the wide gap that we've now actually seen between house prices and wages. So wages seem to have been, yes, on the increase, but at a much lower rate, whereas housing has gone through the roof. And it's a similar graph here in terms of the house price and GDP per capita, how many times salary has come through, and you can sort of see how over time, and this is going back to 1900, mind you, we've just seen this escalation in the ratio between the house price versus the GDP per capita, or real income, if you like, coming into the house, and it's become a real problem, such that, is it changing people's mindsets is what I would argue, and is it our job, is it the government's job to be fixing this, is the other question, I suppose, as well.
Okay, if you think about it, that 2000 date seems to be pretty set there, and you can't. Data doesn't lie, okay? So we all know that from that point of view. So with the data showing us that, obviously there were triggers that caused that. Would you mind providing a bit of an insight, I guess, to our clients in terms of what those causes were?
Yeah, look, if you might have to help me out with some dates here, Luke. In 1999, we introduced the CGT, the 50% CGT rule. We had, was it 1998, the pre-CGT assets that we had? So people that bought before September 1985, that was. We had the pre, yeah. So they were the big changes. And then we also had, negative gearing. As a what year was that? I can't remember the negative gearing intro.
Negative gearing was introduced through the Keating government, actually, in truth. So negative gearing came about that. So that was sometimes in the 80s, and the capital gains regime was also introduced at the same time. And the argument there was that if you were going to invest, so if you were borrowing money to go and buy a business as an example, or if you were borrowing money to go invest in the share market as an example, you're able to claim the interest cost. So it only made sense that would actually follow suit and actually then apply on the property space. And the argument at the time, or the government at the time from that point of view, is that the government were moving away from public housing. So the government had said, well, hang on, we're not going to do the heavy lifting in the public housing space, and what we're going to let the market do that effectively. So investors would come into the market, investors would borrow money, they would go and build homes, which are then used for rentals, for example, as an example, let's say, and that's how that all kind of worked. So that's where that started. But I think that there's a couple of things that you mentioned there, is that in 99 or around 99, as part of the GST reforms, if you remember when GST was first introduced, there was a capital gains discount which was provided through the Howard government. And the capital gains discount at the time by itself is not sufficient enough to say that caused the explosion. But I think there were a couple of things that happened in that period of time where it just got to be a bit like a flywheel. You know how a flywheel builds momentum? I think there were a few things there that all cascaded together to produce the perfect storm.
For
So if we
sure.
think about those perfect storms, so if we think about that, we kind of sit back and say, well, okay, we had our last real recession here in Australia in 1993, if you remember. And that recession was pretty brutal. And a lot of our clients will remember that recession. Some people lost houses, particularly people who were in business and so on. Some people who had over leveraged, had fallen over. And we saw investment banks and we saw banks collapse at the time from that point of view. And that was a pretty deep recession. And if you remember the famous words of Paul Keating, it was the recession we had to have. Since that time, however, Australia has experienced an economic miracle. And we haven't experienced a recession, barring the small little nuance during COVID. We haven't experienced a recession since then. And part of the reason for it is every time we've become close, or every time we've got close to experiencing one, we've had the government step in or the Reserve Bank step in. So the Reserve Bank either steps in and reduces rates rather aggressively, or the government steps in and loosens policy settings in order to keep the liquidity in the market going from that point of view. And what they do is they fuel cheap debt, I guess. So you had all these things conspire at the same time. In addition, you also then had the Howard government introduce capital gains, which was pretty cool, I guess, from that point of view. And then you also had on top of that, I guess, you had the negative gearing, which had been there for a long time, but up until that stage probably wasn't being used as much. Now, if you remember around 2000, and our clients will remember this too, there was that thing called the dot-com boom. So you were investing into share markets and all that kind of stuff. You had the Y2K bug and so on. The world was going to fall apart. And everyone was looking at the share market going, oh my God, the share market is not the place you want to be. We won't be able to turn on the lights and so on. Where can I put some money? And then all of a sudden you looked at the property market and you said, hang on, I can do that. And that kicked off the ball. And what we've seen in the last 20 years is an exacerbation of that, where all of a sudden we saw negative gearing become favourable. We saw the capital gains exemptions also. And this whole notion of we're going to invest money with the idea of getting a rental return, that actually became a secondary thought process. The process was really around, well, hang on a sec, actually I can buy something, hold it, flip it, get a discount, get a tax deduction along the way, and I can keep on doing this. So you can actually see how that kind of worked.
I think that historical view is actually very useful. And when you think back to one of the things you said there, that we didn't have that recession till sort of 92, 93. And but also what happened during that time is housing prices actually came off. So housing prices actually came off substantially, and there were people that found themselves in negative equity, and there was a lot of hurt during that time. Now we haven't experienced that since then, and I would argue that over the course of these 30 years that we haven't experienced that. We've actually built and ingrained this psyche in people that they actually believe that the property market doesn't come down, that it actually does not come off, that it can't happen. Is perhaps that the problem? That people actually genuinely believe that this is an asset class that just keeps rising. And there's been people that have been banging on about this for 20 years and 10 years, and they're still wrong because it's been going for 30 years, hasn't it? But at some point in time, what happens if the market adjusts? And, I've been listening to some of these pundits talking about how do we fix this situation? So there's only two ways you can fix it. Either housing prices have to come down or wages have to come up, or do we do steady as she goes and leave housing prices, pretty flat for the next, I think they're predicting you need 18 or 20 years of flatness in pricing, with wages just coming up incrementally as they have been to sort of catch up and get back to the 3-4 times. I'd like to, throw it out there and sort of say, if you've been in a situation where an asset class has been doing nothing but pretty much going up for a full 30 years, of course it's going to lead to speculation. And we can look back and sort of say, well, yes, there were some capital gains tax incentives where 50% of the gain doesn't get counted after 12 months and the like. We still had, the the link to CPI as well on the capital gains tax as well, and there's talk about maybe that being reintroduced. Mind you, I don't know if they've cut the numbers yet because CPI has been running pretty hot over the last couple of years. That may actually yield a better result than the 50% discount. But having said that, I mean, is it possible that the property market takes a breather at some point in time? And when I say breather, actually suffers some significant falls as well. Because I'm a big believer that the market can regulate itself as well. And I'm not anyone that's listened to me speak before. I'm not a big fan of people meddling. And when I talk about meddling, I talk about the government now telling me that I need to introduce rental caps or that I need to introduce new taxes or remove the ability to take tax deductions, or the bank of mum and dad for that matter. Since when did we create the bank of mum and dad? But that's become almost the only way kids can get into the property market these days. So I think there's a fair bit going on, but no one seems to talk about the supply and demand unless it's in its simplest format, and that is, gee, there mustn't be enough supply, therefore the rental prices have gone up, and so too have the property prices.
I think there's two things I'd like to unpack, and thanks for sharing that insight, Mirko. But there's two things I'd like to unpack on in terms of what you spoke about, and one being societal attitudes, because there has been a change, there has been a shift, because we have moved away from the house being a place of shelter, a place of safety, to a place now of investment from that point of view. So that's tick, and I wouldn't mind unpacking that a little bit more. And then two, let's explore this where we think that might take property market and property prices, I guess, from that point. But let's go back to the first point. If we think back to the early 40s, in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s and so on, and housing was very much seen as a basic human right at that particular point in time. And then we had the Menzies government come in. And the Menzies government made a call at that particular moment in time where the government was building a lot of public housing, if you remember. And if you drive down through Williamstown, if you drive through Port Melbourne, a lot of those cottages were just that. That's what they were. Mind you, those properties are all now sitting at $2.5 million and $3 million respectively. That's a separate issue. But when we think about all those things from that point of view, the Menzies government made a call that they really didn't want public housing. And the reason for it was because people who lived in public housing notionally voted Labor. So in order to counter the voting of Labor, what we'll do is we'll create little capitalists who, by becoming little capitalists, they'll vote Liberal, was the theory. And that's what they've done from that point of view. And if we think about it, public housing went on the nose probably from about the mid-50s, early 60s, up until about the mid-70s when the Fraser government got rid of it entirely. The Keating government and the Hawke government, recognising that there was a problem in that, rather than saying, actually, the government's going to get back into it, introduced the negative gearing. And that was trying to catch up on the shortfall, I guess. But one thing that has happened from a societal perspective, individuals no longer, like if you think about it today, we as human beings all feel wealthier when the house prices go up. So we're part of the problem. We want property prices to rise because if they rise, then we feel wealthier, we feel better. And just as a broader rule, we walk around with our chests out a little bit firmer, I guess, from that point of view. Now, in order to reverse what's occurred in terms of prices, the 2 points that you raised before, either property prices remain stagnant or heaven forbid they fall, that would require enormous political courage. Do we have that?
I don't think we've got the political courage. And you think back to when we tried to create all these little capitalists running around, and we were worried about who's going to vote for who because of our housing policies. That's that. Let's back self-interest, yeah. And I think that there's been a couple of attempts actually at some of the key issues that we've been talking about, being negative gearing and capital gains tax. There's been a couple of attempts at perhaps almost like just suggesting that you may muck around with that stuff, and it's arguably cost people election results as a result of it. So I think it certainly wouldn't be political fortitude and the willingness to make the hard calls that would do this. I actually genuinely believe it would be the market, and And I think that if we think back to the late 80s, early 90s, you know, what were the big differences, and the baby boomers that are on this call will be scratching their heads and saying, I don't know what these people are complaining about at 6-7% interest rates. I was paying 18, 19 and 20% back then. The other issue was unemployment spiked, and it was actually quite high, whereas it wouldn't take too much to rock the economy here, and we're already starting to see snippets of it where the economy has slowed a little bit with the official cash rate at what are we now, 4.35, and we're starting to see a little bit of pain and suffering there. We haven't seen unemployment sort of spike up. In fact, employment has been really strong. But if we did, could we not see a problem perhaps down the track that is actually market related as opposed to government or policy induced? And I think that that's something that people often forget. We talk about our investment decisions and allocating capital and the like. You said it before, Luke. People just assume that if they buy the property, it'll go up in value. They feel much better about themselves, and away they go. When you start looking at investments in the property market, you really genuinely are making a decision based on, do I believe it will go up in value? Because you certainly wouldn't be doing it on yield. So you're not. No one's going to be enticed by 2 and 3% yields, particularly now that term deposits are 4 and 5% as well. So I think that's another factor to the equation. I'm sure we're going to touch on immigration and the like, but there's a lot of homes that are being bought without finance these days as well, as we saw recently.
From what you're saying, what appears, I guess, from that point of view, is that when we think about the way the property market has gone from that end, it sounds like there's been a lot of meddling from governments, which therefore then, I guess, in response to your query around, do we let the market do what it should do? I'm like you, I'm a firm believer that market should actually drive these outcomes. But the reality is that every time the market looks like it's going to have a bit of a conniption, or if it looks like it's going to get soft or whatever, we've always had a reserve bank which has been accommodative. We've also then had government policy which has been accommodative. So the reality is, every time we have a problem, so we have governments and reserve banks which have an aversion to cycles or economic cycles. So when you and I went to school and we studied economics, we were told that every 7 years there was effectively a cycle, a boom or a bust, effectively. And that's how economic cycles worked. We don't have cycles now. We manufacture outcomes. And the reality is, by manufacturing outcomes, you don't get to experience this. So I guess, when we sit down and we look at the property market and we say to ourselves, well, okay, is it possible that property prices could come down? Well, you could have been arguing this for the last 15, 20 years and you look like an idiot still, because it just hasn't happened. And I guess, the resignation now is, we're not talking about prices coming down. We're actually saying, how do our kids afford to come into the market? That's an acknowledgement that we've lost the battle from that point of view. And I think, one of the things that I think is really important to probably flesh out is the fact that, whilst it's easy, and it's very popular to sit here and say, but it's negative gearing, or it's just capital gains, or it's bad government policy. These are factors. Let's not kid ourselves from that point of view. But there are other factors. And if we think about government policy itself, today we as a country are managed by 3 levels of government. We have federal government, state government, and local government. So let's think about housing policy, all right? And this just shows you the complexity and the stupidity of Australia at the best of times. So at a local level, it is the local government's responsibility to make sure that planning restrictions and all that kind of stuff are managed. And they'll make controls as to the density levels, parking requirements, structural requirements in terms of the house and how it's built, and so on from that point of view. At a state level, the state will release land. And invariably they're slow in terms of releasing land from that point of view. And at a federal level, we'll have the migration policy. From that point of view, in terms of the migration that comes in, and also the concept of foreign ownership. So what you've got here is, you've got 3 layers of government that don't speak to each other, each coming up with their own policies and coming up with their own arrangements, which has a bearing and an impact on property prices. So that, so when you think about the mess we're in, it's a combination of all these factors rather than one factor alone. So I think at the moment there's there's a member of the of Parliament from the Greens who's been arguing about this and look and argues forcefully about this as well, where his view is very much around the negative gearing and very much around the capital gains route, which is the populist argument from that point of view. And it's the easy one to hit. But the reality is, it's not just those two factors alone. There's other factors which are driving this, I think, from that point. And I think the other factor, and I think this is probably something that we don't really talk about often, but perhaps we should raise it, is the Ponzi scheme that we are. Because the reality is, banks want the property market to be strong, because when the property market's strong, they're on lending monies to people and they're making interest and so on, which therefore means that they're producing higher corporate profits. We as shareholders in banks, be it through our super funds, be it as individuals or whatever, from that point of view, want the banks to perform well. Because if they're performing well, that means our dividends are higher, our franking credits are higher, and so on. So we've got this vicious circle where, the misalignment is where we're kind of saying the pursuit is profit rather than the pursuit is societal outcome. That's just a thought. What are your views?
100%. And this goes back to people will allocate their capital where they think they're going to get their best bang for buck and their best return on investment. So it doesn't matter as simple a view as you want to take when you've got your capital in your hand and you're going to deploy it, you're thinking to yourself, where am I going to get the best value for money? And, at times it's going to be the share market, at times it's going to be the property market. And as it stands now, psychologically, I think that, we've certainly had this belief that the property market will always continue to give us fantastic returns, particularly by way of growth. Now, the question is, will that sort of continue? And will the numbers sort of take care of themselves? So will the young kids of today that look at their pay grades and sort of say, well, do I really want to sign myself up to a 30-year loan, for example, which is a big ask. I pulled some numbers from the Australian Bureau of Statistics just to give you an idea of sort of the mean property prices that we've got going on in Australia. And so this was at the end of the December quarter here. Can you see that on the screen, Luke, just to make sure?
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So when you look at so the orange line represents the end of the December quarter and the mean dwelling price. So in New South Wales, we'll call it Sydney if you like. The mean price was $1.184 million for a property there. Closer to home here in Victoria, we're sitting at 895, and even in the Australian context overall, it's 933 as the mean price. And there's some big numbers there, and I take that. I look back and go, well, how do we sort of extrapolate that? And let's assume a single income household, perhaps a young graduate that's walked into his or her first job making, let's say that they as a graduate getting paid $70K would be a pretty reasonable starting salary, right? At $70,000. How are they going to afford, let's call it 900,000. So Victoria was 895. So let's go $900,000. The assessment rate, I had a look at this yesterday for a new loan, is 9.69%. Let's call it 10%. So on $900,000, the bank will say, right, Mirko, you need $90,000 of free income to service that debt. All right. So even if I had a deposit of $200,000 at 700 grand, I still need 70 grand. Right. So you tell me how on earth someone is actually going to be able to borrow that money and not get themselves into a jam, even with the bank of mum and dad. I mean, we deal with baby boomers, that sort of predominantly our client base in truth. And, if they have the capability to provide their children with $100,000 or $200,000, it's still, the numbers don't stack up. So I'm now the young guy, a graduate. I'm probably going to stay at home. We've got a few of these in our own households, Luke. I don't think they're ever going to leave, mate, to be perfectly honest. And but I look at it and say, how on earth will they actually get into the market? And will they, in the end, have no desire to get in the market? So these numbers don't work for me. I'm not going to spend, 80% of my income servicing a debt that I didn't really want to sign up for in the first place. because I would like to have some sort of life, you know, over the next 30, 40 years of my journey. What do you reckon?
I think what you've just defined, and it's actually quite frightening. So what you're saying is that the average income earner or the average income earning family cannot afford the average price of a house in Australia.
I can't see it. Like if I double those numbers, Luke, and let's say there's 150 grand coming into the house, you still on 900,000. You still have to try and find 90 after tax, after grocery bills, after school fees, after buying a cup of coffee. You got to find that free disposable cash flow. It's not there. It actually doesn't
Yeah.
exist, and that's what concerns me. And I think that we've already seen a little bit less activity in the marketplace. We've seen quite a few houses on the market as well, and we don't do our. You spoke about before how many levels of government that we have. In Victoria, we're doing a great old job of trying to balls this up right about now, I would argue. And with the introduction of the increased land tax and the like, have a for our listeners out there, if you want to have a little bit of entertainment, jump on your realestate.coms, your domain.coms, and have a look at the properties that are on the market, particularly say down the coast, down the Mornington Peninsula. It's incredible how many places are actually on the market. Now, that's probably not going to solve the housing shortage that we've got, because a lot of those are lifestyle properties and people are just paying land tax on them. But the reality is that they are on the market because the rules have now come about such that people say it's actually not worthwhile me hanging on to this property. There's some cracking properties on the cliffs of Portsea and Sorrento and like that never come on the market. And now when I look at the map, there's a whole heap of little dots there with people saying, no, this is not working for me. And you can imagine how much wealth those guys have got.
Yeah, no, look, you're right about that. And I think one thing we are definitely over-regulated from that point of view. And what we've seen from governments is the unintended consequences of bad decisions, if that makes sense. So, short-termism and what seems like, okay, what we're trying to do is just, but it's always got to do with propping up a market, if that kind of, that's been the motivation, I guess, from that point of view. And it's part of that is because I think the learned belief, and I think it's learned because it wasn't like this in Australia previously, but the learned belief now is definitely around, well, I see property as being part of my wealth bucket, and I count property as part of my net worth. Whereas previously, if you think about even when we started in financial planning many, many moons ago, this is before the internet, Mirka, but when we started...
We couldn't go on realestate.com back then.
No, you couldn't. But, if you think about when we first started from that point of view, net worth, your property was a lifestyle asset. It wasn't included in your net worth calculation. Today, it's included in your net worth calculation from that point of view. And you can see the dilemmas here. But one of the things there, and I'm just listening to, when you think about, and you said the famous words, the state government will find a way to balls this as well. The reality is it's because their noses are in the trough. When you've been living off the stamp duty bandwagon for so long, you actually need property prices to keep on continuing, and you need people to turning over properties from that point of view. But I do share your view there is eventually there's going to be a generation of people who turn around and say, I don't want a part of it. I'm not going to buy it, which then brings the conundrum about immigration and foreign ownership. Because in Australia today, the average Australian household has 2.48 occupants. That's the average Australian household. Now, last year, on the back of COVID, because we had a couple of years that were quieter, we've brought in over 500,000 people from that point of view. Now, we build, on average, 170,000 homes per year. So if you multiply 170,000 homes by 2.48, that means of the 500,000 people that came into Australia last year, 80,000 are going to be homeless before they've even landed.
And you would have heard me tapping away because I can't help myself. That's the numbers that I'm coming up with as well. So the numbers purely don't stack up. And this is not a call for us to say we need to stop immigration. Like, this is more a case of, guys, is anyone actually looking at the raw numbers here and saying the supply is not going to equal the demand? It is therefore going to create a massive problem. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing it by way of property prices, by way of rental prices. I don't know if anyone's tried to rent a property in recent times, but there are queues around the corner in most instances of people trying to get a rental property. Forget about trying to buy one. It's pretty tough out there.
I think the other thing there too, and just thinking as you were speaking there too, like if we talk about the unintended consequences of dumb decisions, if you remember back in the late 90s and all of a sudden there was this urgency or this urge for everyone to go to university. So rather than going out and getting a trade and doing those sort of things and getting your hands dirty, you were encouraged to go to university, get a degree, and then you work professionally and so on from that point of view. And all of a sudden it became discouraged to become a tradie, to go to trade school. And we were shutting down TAFEs and all the like from that point of view. Now, the reality is if we're trying to build 170,000 homes and yet we don't have the trade to service 170,000 homes, what do you think that does to inflation?
Oh, and we've already seen it. I mean, we've seen governments on the infrastructure projects basically taking trades away from the construction industry as we know it generally, and having to pay inflated rates, which the construction industry can't compete with. So it's there's a really broad discussion here to be had about what we're doing from a policy point of view as well to try and address some of these issues, because some of the unintended consequences are huge. Like you look at some of these new taxes that have been created, the unintended consequences could be that people start falling out of love with property as well, which then provides a new crisis again. So your supply comes down in a rising demand, you've got more issues. We've got infrastructure projects that last time I checked, these aren't accountable to anybody. Like, it's acceptable to have blowouts of, I'm not talking about millions. The last blowout I heard of was from 10 to 26 billion on one of the projects. And I sit back and go, well, the reason that's happening is because there's no accountability and there's no one actually pays attention to what's going on. Now there's some recipients there that are smoking cigars going, my life is pretty good, I'm earning 2-3 times more than I used to, and all power to them. Of course, the people are going to follow the money, aren't they? But then the unintended consequence is that we end up talking about a housing crisis. I had a look at I'm a big fan of a study that gets done. It's called Demographia, and basically what they do is they look at housing affordability around the world, and they sort of pick eight in sort of 94 major housing markets. Call them cities, and 8 countries, and Australia is one of those countries, and we're looking at the US, Canada, Singapore, United Kingdom, and we look at the most unaffordable cities, if you like, and it's actually sad reading when you look at it and you realize that in Australia, I mean, I'll rattle off a couple of these. Sydney is the second most unaffordable city in the world when it comes to housing versus median incomes. Melbourne is the 9th most unaffordable. Adelaide is the 18th. So these are the listings that we don't want to be on, right? We'd rather be on the most livable cities, but we're not on those either. We're actually in a scenario where our when they do their scores and their rankings about unaffordability, we come up as severely unaffordable in all 5 of our major cities. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad, and you're now being compared to the likes of New York, Hong Kong, London, and those and I look at that and I say, so what's the long-term effect of that? Well, the long-term effect might be just a change in mindset, where people say, well, if I'm not going to own a home, I'm not going to feel like this is home. Perhaps I'll look elsewhere. Perhaps I will experience working overseas and the like for the younger generation. I think we've got some really interesting and scary issues to deal with here.
No, you do paint a pretty awkward picture, I guess, both for now and also in the future. And I think the other thing that you could extend on that is, Australia today, or Melbourne, we've had the moniker of one of the most livable cities in the world. And if we become one of the most unaffordable cities in the world, then the reality is people won't want to come here. So you're going to lose that just naturally from that point of view. The other thing that you're also going to have is, as we're finding in Sydney now, where younger people are saying they're leaving Sydney to go live somewhere else because they simply can't afford to live in Sydney and raise a family and do the things they want. From that point of view. So these are very real problems, and you can see how everything, even with our discussion today, how everything, a decision which seems inconsequential in the scheme of things has an unintended consequence, and then cascading into other things creates this schmozzle that we find ourselves in. But we've killed the why we're here aspect of it. I guess one thing that's clear about this, Mirko, and we've done a lot of research and a lot of reading in this space, and we speak to a lot of our clients, there's no silver bullet here that's going to fix this mess. And I take on board your point before of it would require a government with enormous political will and enormous political courage to do something here. And the reality is we've seen wages grow by 4%, and we've seen we've seen wages grow by 4%, and we've seen properties grow by 8%. And it's effectively happened over 20 years. So for parity to be restored, we'd effectively need property prices to remain flat, as you've said before, for 18 years, and that's not going to happen. There's no government that's going to sit here and go, vote for me because we're going to stabilise house prices for the next 18 years, unless society changed its attitude. So that's that point. So I guess if we think about the solutions that are available to us, and mindful that there isn't any silver bullets, what do you think, if I could ask you and say, if you had three things you could change, what are those three things that you think these are the things that could work, mindful that it's not going to provide an immediate impact, but a medium to longer term impact?
Yeah, perhaps, when we talk about the tax system, I think it's really unfair to sort of just wipe out things like capital gains tax discounts and the like for people that went in good faith, when they initially went into these investments. But perhaps rather than retrospectively sort of looking forward, can we have some tax incentives for people that genuinely are providing accommodation at decent levels, and at reasonable prices? Can we have incentives for that? Because then all of a sudden, people can look at that and as investors say, well, okay, I've got an incentive to play in this area, but I also have the greater social benefit and the greater good, which is to actually supply much needed housing for people. I think that I'm not too sure that we've sort of got the infrastructure correct. We talk about infrastructure as dictating our standard of living and our quality of life, and there's a lot to be said about that. But I don't think we've given our infrastructure a lot of thought. And we talk about everybody trying to live within 20 kilometres of the CBD, which we know is not a long-term feasible way to go. Give people an incentive to live regionally, if you like. We've got some amazing areas like Geelong, like Ballarat, Bendigo, and the like, but getting to and from, Melbourne, if you like, requires a motor vehicle, which requires more infrastructure versus, there's fast trains in most countries that you go and visit that actually work, and they move people around every day pretty quickly. So I look at the infrastructure that we seem to be, we're more worried about, I don't know, removing a level crossing, in my local area than perhaps finding a way to get 5,000 people into the CBD and make it a reasonable commute for them. So I think that we need to look at that. And I think we need to take a leaf out of what's happening overseas. So as you know, we spend a lot of time following institutional money and sort of saying, where's the big money sort of going into what type of projects and the like. There's a lot of build to rent stuff going on in the United States, in the UK, and it's actually designed for large institutions that are willing to have very patient capital to actually build and collect, reasonable incomes and returns from their investments. But as a result, they're able to fill those buildings with people that, you know, feel the comfort and security of knowing that their tenancies are secure, that they live in a community, that they perhaps have amenities that they wouldn't normally have access to. And we're only sort of starting to scratch the surface on that. There's, you know, in the US, there's whole communities of multifamily, which are basically communities that, and it could be, say, 300 homes in a gated community where nobody actually owns those homes. The people are happy to rent, and it provides them with the ability to sort of live a comfortable retirement. Perhaps they're not having to worry about, you know, having to maintain a home per se, but for the sake of living in a community, paying rent, they're able to then, you know, enjoy a reasonable lifestyle and retirement. So we don't seem to do a lot of that here. And I think we need to start thinking about what's happening overseas and how they're trying to find creative solutions for this.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. Look, I think, if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind pulling apart a little bit further on those tax issues. I think on the tax side, I think your suggestion there is valid. I'd like to throw a Furby in there, and I do agree with you. I think removing the capital gains pieces retrospectively, I don't think is fair. Adjusting and perhaps moving forwards might be a fairer outcome, I guess, from that point of view. And perhaps maybe not providing the discount, but maybe just leaving it at you tax at your marginal rate effectively from that point of view. So that could be the first point. The negative gearing side, I kind of look at that and think that there is a role for the private areas or for private investors to play in this space. But I would make it I'd put the watermarks, or I'd adjust the watermarks on that, where I'd sit back and say, well, okay, the property must be rented or generate rent for at least 90% of the year for it to be deductible, I guess, from that point of view. And that would remove a lot of properties which are now coming onto market and moving out of longer term rentals to shorter term rentals on the back of the Airbnb and stays requirements, I guess, from that end. So that would really disrupt and challenge that market, because I think, you know, the idea now of buying a property and I'll rent it or I'll put it out for rent, and if I rent it out for 3 days, but as long as it's available for 365, I can claim the full rental, or I can claim the full deduction. Yeah, that kind of doesn't pass the sniff test or the smell test, I guess, you know, in that one. I do think there's a lot of merit in what you're saying around this, you know, build to rent, and I do see a lot of movement there. But I think there needs to be some government initiatives to particularly reward those investors, particularly institutional investors, if you're going to do that. Because the reality is, up until now, the psyche of Australians has been, we buy property to profit. So that's been the psyche. And what we need to do is we actually need to change that. So the psyche needs to be altered from profit to one of income. And that income needs to be comparable to your risk-free rate of return. You know, it needs to be comparable. And the other thing that we need to look at is, we also need to look at that pendulum which swings. You know, at one stage it sits in the landlord side, and then it sits in the tenant side, and so on. It's got to be somewhere where it's just firmly in the middle. Because ultimately, if we're going to build these things and we're going to have this co-investment, well, then we need those sort of outcomes, I guess, from that end. The other thing I think we also need to work on, and just throwing potential solutions out there, is really around the removal of restrictions that are in this space. Because we've got this whole scenario where, if we think about what's happening today, there are a lot of planning restrictions that are being put in place, not by developers per se, but by people who are already living in established areas, going, well, it's not going to happen in my backyard. I'm happy for you to do whatever you want to do, but not in my suburb or not in my backyard, so to speak. And you kind of sit back, and there was an article written by Alan Kohler a while ago which talks about the Great Divide, and he talks about the reverse donut, and that's how Australia has built its society. So we have high-rise density close to the city or within the city, but as we move out, we become single dwellings. And as we become single dwellings, in many cases, it's on 600, 700, 1,000 square metre blocks. And you've got this, you know, 20 square home on this 1,000 square metre block. And the idea is, well, these blocks are available for development, or surely they should be available for development. So things like parking restrictions, things like permit zones and all these kind of stuff, I think we need to relook at that. And I buy into your statement before, particularly around the infrastructure piece. The biggest issue or the biggest challenge facing us today is that very, very point. You know, I remember the old St Albans line, Mirko. The old St Albans line stopped there, and then all of a sudden it was electrified to Sunbury. So all we did was kick the can down the road. We didn't build any new infrastructure. We just electrified 3 extra stations. And then we said that was an upgrade. It's not an upgrade. Proper infrastructure is express trains working and so on. The fact that we can go to any global city in the world and jump on a train and get to somewhere else very quickly without using a cab or using a car, and yet here in Melbourne or in Sydney we can't do that, tells you there's a problem. So there needs to be a massive investment. I guess one of the things that our client has raised too, which I think is a really clever idea, is that we're particularly on student immigration, and we've had a lot of students coming back into the country with all that sort of stuff. Perhaps changing the tax laws or the settling clause, I guess, from that point of view, where you might be able to rent a room to a student coming into the country from that point of view, who may pay rent, stay in your home and all that kind of stuff, but you don't pay tax on that stuff. So that removes some of that pressure, I guess, from that end. There's obviously risks with that, inviting people into your home who you don't know and all those sort of things. But, when you kind of start to piece these all together, there's solutions there. It sounds like it's going to have to be multi-pronged, but I guess the question, and mindful of time, do we have a government who's prepared to have that sort of a discussion with the Australian people?
Well, I don't think we do right now, but I think we desperately need that. And just thinking about your students' example there, some of these university campuses around Australia are huge, and but quite often it actually needs privateers that are coming in to build student accommodation and the like, or massive benefactors that have left very generous inheritance and bequests across to universities. But I think one of the things we've got here in Australia up our sleeve is we've got the big superannuation funds as well, and they happily invest their money overseas in projects like the build to rent and the like. Perhaps that's something that can be an incentive for them to do such investment in Australia, which in turn may, benefit members and the like. So I think we need to have a look at, big institutional capital and where it actually flows, and and who the end user is as well. There's got to be a way that we can create a win-win scenario where it's not just the investor that wins, but it's also the end user that feels like they're winning the game as well. At the moment, it feels very binary. It feels like that, whoever wins means that someone's going to lose in a big way. And I don't know that that's what that's not the society we were trying to design in the first place.
Yeah, I think you're right there, mate. I think the other thing there too that's also worth mentioning is that, and I think you're headed down the right path, is we've got to make other forms of investment attractive, and we've got to make it to the point where you kind of sit back and go, well, if these things are equally as attractive, be it through tax incentives or whatever it might be, then I'm better off doing that than perhaps using property as a speculative tool from that end. And we go back to property being what it's supposed to be. But, the challenge for all of us, and for the challenge for all our clients on the screen here today, is that, we've got our own children, for example, and if our own children are okay, then it's the grandchildren who aren't okay. There's someone coming through who's going to be caught here. And my heart goes out to anybody that was born in 1983 and onwards. Because the reality, that's the millennial generation. And all of a sudden, 1983, in 2003, they turned 20. And then in 2005, they were 25. They walked out, within a degree, perhaps, from that point of view. Eyes are blurry, and the property market has just started to take off from that point of view. And since then, they've been chasing their tail. And the reality is, for anybody who isn't in that market today, who's trying to get in that market, and your point before being valid, if the average earnings today of a household are 100,000 and the average median price is 900,000, so we're sitting at 9 times. Now that's assuming that they're buying in a suburb like, on the outskirts. We're talking 20, 30 kilometres out of Melbourne. If you're buying in that inner ring of 10, 15 kilometres, your medium house price is not 900. Your medium house price is 1.5, 1.7. That's the problem, okay? And, so these are massive challenges that we as a society face. And I think there needs to be and I do agree with you on your point there before that you don't think the governments have the courage, but there needs to be government courage to sit down and have this conversation with the Australian people to say, well, this is the problem. How do we fix it? And we can't fix it with just this or that, but it's going to require a lot of things where there's going to have to be give and take. And perhaps the incentives won't be at a personal level where you get the incentive here at an investment level on the personal side, but it might occur through a superannuation side as an example, or whatever it might be.
I think that's probably the biggest challenge is to actually find a way to look at solutions to this issue. From looking at it from what I've seen over the last sort of 10, 20 years, all of the things that we've sort of come up with that are incentives and have actually worked in the complete opposite way. You know, when we raised the threshold for first home buyers grant and everything, magically the price of those properties went up to that new threshold, right? You know, we do this stuff, and blind Freddie can see what's going to happen, but somehow we still continue to sort of do this. So I in preparation for this, I read something, and a guy described Sydney as the way they're heading. He said it could become a city with no grandchildren that live in it. And I think that, you know, when you think about that statement, you go, well, the way we're going, it could well be the case, unless we can sort of resolve this issue.
Yeah, that is frightening, mate. That is frightening. Mirko, I can't believe it's 1:30 already, mate, and I don't think we've even touched the surface in terms of where this is at. And to all our wonderful clients out there today too, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your many comments and your feedback. And what we've tried to do is run the conversation based upon that feedback. Look, this is, I don't know if we've resolved much. Obviously, what we've kind of highlighted today is how difficult the housing crisis is here in Australia, and it's become something which, you know, a bit like a flywheel has gained a life in itself, in the sense that, you know, it was a problem. We knew it was a problem 20 years ago, 30 years ago. We really didn't do much about it. We kind of put our head in the sand, and this is the unintended consequence of doing that. You know, 30 years down track, we're at this point where you kind of go, well, what's it look like in 20 years? And if today is unaffordable, in 20 years, I'd hate to imagine what it looks like. And the pressures on the bank of mum and dad are going to grow exponentially, on top of mum and dad having to look after the care costs potentially for themselves and the like. So, you know, this has massive ramifications across many sectors from that point of view. So, look, I imagine it's something that we'll be discussing more over the course of the year. But for all our listeners today, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you got a lot of value from this. Feel free to reach out and let us know and give us any feedback you think may be beneficial. And until we speak again, take care and all the very best. Cheers.
Thanks for joining us, guys. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.